welcome to Media Mac. Dr. Shermak here. Hello, everybody. Welcome back in. This is week 2 here on Media Mac. Week 1 is in the books, and I'm really excited to have you back listening here on week 2. Welcome back. And before we jump into our new topic this week, which is books, and I'm excited to talk about that, let's get back to a topic we touched on a lot in week 1, which is the Super Bowl. All right. And we just had the Super Bowl. So I recorded that podcast on the Friday before the Super Bowl. So I haven't talked to you since the Super Bowl actually happened. Our focus, our reason for talking about the Super Bowl was not only just a timeliness matter, right? It was the talk of the world when we recorded that episode, but it also has a direct tie into our week 1 discussion about what is mass communication, because the Super Bowl is the mass communication event to end all mass communication events, what we call a mega event, or a media spectacle, as we referred to in week 1. And now we have some numbers to back that up. So I wanted to start off the episode today talking a little bit about that. So number one, if you watch the game, you know that the Seattle Seahawks beat the New England Patriots, right? And it was not a super exciting game if you love points, and most people do. Very dominantly defensive game. There weren't even any touchdowns scored until the fourth quarter. All right. So I mention that because, not because this is a sports podcast, even though y'all know I love me some sports, but it had an effect. It had an effect. All right. So the numbers at the end of the day on NBC, 124.9 million viewers. Where does that stack up? Second highest Super Bowl audience in history. All right. But even though it's the second highest in history, that's actually down 2% from last year's record audience. That last year's record was 127.7 million. So it came very close, but no new record this year. That number was likely dragged down due to the game. All right, due to the game. At one point, the viewership peaked at 137.8 million. 137.8 million. Now you might be asking me, hey Shermak, it peaked at 137 million, but you said the viewership was only 124.9 million. What gives? All right. It's all how it's figured out. Nielsen, who does these ratings, actually when they tabulate the ratings, they look at how many viewers are watching at a particular minute. And so they look at that number for every single minute of the Super Bowl. And so for all the minutes that they tabulated during the game, the highest single minute of viewership was 137.8 million, which was a record. And that happened in the second quarter. And it might have been some of the lead in to the halftime, of course, with Bad Bunny, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But what is most likely to happen is that this defensive struggle, not a super great football game by most people's standards, probably dragged the numbers down just far enough in the second half to bring the average number down to 124.9. So that's just a little bit of behind the scenes about how those numbers are made. Let's talk about Bad Bunny. Bad Bunny's halftime show averaged 128.2 million viewers domestically. I want to underscore the domestically part, because as of this recording, which is here on Friday, February 13th, spooky, we still are waiting for global numbers to come in, at least from the sources I saw. Now, maybe they're out there and I missed them. Forgive me if that was the case. But according to the reports that I reviewed in preparation for the show today, we were still waiting for those international numbers to come in. So this 128.2 million number is what we're going to work with. This is down 4% from last year's halftime show, or I should say the previous year's halftime show featuring Kendrick Lamar. But it's still higher than the overall game average. So a little under 4 million viewers more for the halftime show versus the game. Another interesting element here, Telemundo, which is part of the NBC Comcast Universal group, Their Spanish language coverage drew 3.3 million viewers. That's the largest Spanish language Super Bowl audience ever. But I'll be really curious to see more of these global numbers because, as we know, Bad Bunny is an international star with great appeal all over the world. So those numbers will be really, really interesting to see when they come in. The NFL reported that 4 billion social media views globally in the first 24 hours after the game. That is up 137% over the previous year. More than half of those views are from, views are from international markets. So that gives you somewhat of an idea of what the international audience may have contributed to the viewership. So really important to see. And just as they liked it, Apple Music, which was the sponsor and is the sponsor of the halftime show, Bad Bunny's album hit number 1 in 46 countries following the performance. So it had a really, really huge impact. Why do we continue to talk about it? Well, A, I like to follow up on things that we talked about in previous episodes. But B, this sort of proves it that this was a media spectacle, mass media event. Think about it this way. Even what is being called a down year, more than 125 million people watched the Super Bowl. That's 40% of the U.S. population. That's wild. Getting the U.S. population to do anything in unison is a near impossible task. The Super Bowl still does it pretty darn well. And going back to the fragmentation that we talked about, right, with the industry, so on and so forth, it's evident right here before us. Nielsen used what they call a big data plus panel to measure this audience. And what it does is it brings all these different data points together from, cable, kind of your traditional cable set-top boxes, all the way to smart TVs, streaming from your laptop, from your tablet, from your phone, all these different areas. It's been a real challenge for audience measurement. And so they did a new system this year to try to help make that a little bit better. They're still working on it. And the debate around that still continues. There's a pilot program right now that is being put together by Nielsen, kind of doing the same thing they did this year, but retroactively applying it to previous years. So there's a possibility that number, that all-time record from the Chiefs-Eagles Super Bowl, now from 2025, that number could go up if they look at that using this new metric and do a different measurement. So the point here is that measuring audiences is getting really complicated. And this is really important because audience measurement has always been a part of media in figuring out how much do we charge for ads, so on and so forth. It's getting more complicated, not less. So keep that in mind as we continue to talk in this semester about the importance of audience to all the different forms of media that we'll be analyzing throughout this semester. I think it's really, really critical. So let's pivot now. Let's pivot to something that is not really associated with the Super Bowl at all, and that is books. We're going kind of old school this week, and I do mean really old school. We're going to talk some seriously old dates. Books are what I call the mass communication OG, all right? Everything that we study in this class, every medium that we will cover this semester stands on the shoulders of what books made possible. It's absolutely true. So you might think of books as not maybe the hippest of mass communication. You might not think of it as sort of a digital or electronic mass communication, even though it is. But there would be none of this modern stuff today if not for books. So, sorry, I needed a sip of coffee there. All right, I try to do limited editing. I'm just being real with y'all here. Here's the thing about books. They are so deeply woven into our culture that we often forget that they are a form of mass communication, let alone the fact that they were the first. It's sort of like teaching fish about water, right? You're swimming in it, and You don't even notice the water around you because it's just inherently a part of your world every single day. Books were revolutionary. They were revolutionary. They taught us how to connect. They taught us how to learn. They taught us how to grow ideas, big ideas. And the modern society that we live in was made possible by books. Knowledge prior to books was kind of scattered, maybe even locked up. Only the very powerful had access to any kind of knowledge. Religious institutions held knowledge within their walls. If you were a part of the kind of educated elite class, you had access to this knowledge. But books came along and truly democratized knowledge. They spread it. They allowed people to access it. And that really changed our world. You go back and you think a little bit about pre-modern books. It's kind of interesting. When the concept of books first arrived, Socrates, pretty smart dude, he actually had a fear of literacy. He feared that the ability to read would weaken the mind. He thought people would stop memorizing things. I think this is really interesting because this kind of reminds me, like, Socrates has like video games are going to make you kill people vibes. It has AI is going to make you a robot vibes, right? One thing we're going to learn very quickly in this class as we move forward, and as we will discuss on this podcast, is fear of technology has a very, very long history. Since the beginning of any kind of advancements in technology, people have been afraid of them, right? We can take it back, thinking about like studies in media, studies in mass communication. There was the magic bullet theory that was invented primarily around movies where, people really believed if someone saw a murder committed on the big screen at a movie theater, it would make them go out and commit murder. Magic bullet, right? And of course, over the years, we've learned that isn't true, but it keeps kind of coming back this way, right? When I was a kid, I'm a kid of the 80s and 90s, the fear was always video games. Don't play those violent video games. You're going to be violent. I'm not really a violent dude. And I play a lot of video games. So these fears have lingered for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. I think what's interesting about our pre-modern books is how the writing had to change in order for the books to become usable. What I mean by that, some examples are adding spaces between words, right? Some of the first books or versions of books were written without spaces between words. People couldn't understand them. You have to make media technology accessible to everyone in order for it to reach a mass and have us study it here in this class. You had something come along named codex. All right, codex. So we're moving from kind of like these scrolls and folded pamphlets to stacked and bound pages. And these pages, first off, pages themselves were an invention. Pagination. It allowed us to skim. It allowed the reading to be organized for us to navigate. So things have to be user-friendly. But even with these advancements and the evolution to make them a little more user-friendly, books were handwritten. They were incredibly expensive. If you wanted to make one Bible, the Bible, by the way, the best-selling book of all time, that's just a fact. It's not a claim of any kind. That's a true fact. If you wanted to make one Bible back in the early days of books, it took the skin of an entire flock of sheep for the parchment to make that book. That's really expensive. That's really valuable, right? So you can imagine just how expensive it was and how costly those books were, and it made accessibility much more difficult. Go back to the 1400s, all right? 1400s, and we have something come along that changes the entire world. Johannes Gutenberg brings along movable type, all right? The real invention wasn't necessarily the press. itself, it was the metallurgy. All right, super fancy word. I can't even say it. Metallurgy is the science of creating reusable metal letters. So learning how to melt and shape that was the advancement, the scientific advancement that allowed for the printing press to exist. And as soon as this happened, Western civilization went from more of an oral tradition into a written edition, and it was easier to spread more consistent messages to more people in that written tradition. Because prior to Gutenberg, most stories were told in verse, kind of a sing-songy sort of way of sharing stories, because remembering things in a song is easier to remember, right? It's easier to remember that way and memorize and pass along. The prose fiction that we think about when we think of books never existed early on. All right, the news that we think about printed in a newspaper wasn't printed on paper. It was shared aloud, town crier style, if that rings a bell. I think this is kind of fun. Many monks early on opposed movable type. They said it was evil. They said it was a threat to their role as the keepers of knowledge. Again, another moment of technological advancement met with fear of the unknown, or fear of the assumptions of what would happen. So Gutenberg comes along, invents the printing press in the 1400s. We move forward to the 1600s. That's when we start to see some of the novels and the books that we really recognize today. The late 1700s and 1800s, this sort of modern day book starts to evolve and mature a little bit. And then the mid-1900s, there was a flourishing literary culture. Magazines cultivated ideas that moved into long-form books. Publishers in this time really became the gatekeepers. Speaking about our models from week one, publishers are the gatekeepers of the book industry. They filter for quality. And when we get into talking in the next segment a little bit about the modern book industry, that's going to matter a lot. The role of publisher as gatekeeper, but we'll get there. One thing we cannot forget here in the United States is just how critical the connection is between books and the birth of this country. The American Revolution was deeply connected to the press. Much of the revolutionary sentiment was spread by pamphlets, printed arguments, pushing for independence. And that's why the United States was the first country to put freedom of the press into its Constitution. I'm in the Questonian newsroom right now recording this, and we have the First Amendment on the wall here in our newsroom. I think it's really, really important to have that out and remember its purpose, especially these days. Remember its purpose and have it be our North Star for what we do in journalism. It was no accident that freedom of the press was put in the U.S. Constitution. Print culture made this country. Print culture made this country. So books are foundational. The printing press is foundational. Where does it go from here? How does it look today? We'll come back and talk about that in segment 2. You're listening to Media Mac. We'll be right back.
Stay connected to your campus. The Questonian has been Cuesta College's trusted news source since 1966. From breaking news to campus life, we cover the stories that matter to you. Follow us at The Questonian on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, or visit questonian.com.
We are back. It is Media Mac, Dr. Shermak here. Thanks so much for joining. Welcome back from the break. This is week 2, and we are discussing books. And in the first segment, we talked about the foundational ideas behind books, the principles of it, the printing press, its establishment in this world, spreading ideas, helping to establish the United States as a country, so on and so forth. Let's hit the fast forward button and jump to the modern publishing landscape of today. All right. Today, about 5 publishers control about 2/3 of all books published in the United States. Some of these names are probably familiar to you: HarperCollins, Penguin Random House, Simon & Schuster, so on. The other third of those books, they're published by thousands of other smaller publishers, university presses, kind of indie houses, small publishers who in total really contribute a lot to the publishing landscape. So what's happening in this industry is what's happening in a lot of media industries right now, and that is consolidation. What does that mean? It's less competition for authors, which is no bueno, because that means fewer choices for readers and more power concentrated in fewer hands. Not necessarily all that democratic, right? For a system that was founded on democratic principles. So if you think back to the mass communication lens that we set up in week 1, who are the gatekeepers here? Who decides to get what gets published? Well, it's the publishers, right? We can't talk about books unless we talk about Amazon, all right? Some of you might be young enough to not realize that Amazon began as a bookstore. I remember when Amazon first came around, I was doing an internship while I was an undergrad at Indiana University. I was working for this company called Unext. And the president of Unext created online classes, which that was like 2000, 2001. That was a very innovative thing at the time. People weren't taking online classes like you are literally listening to this podcast. Well, most of you, I would imagine. And Amazon was only a bookstore. It was a great bookstore. You wanted to go buy a book, of any kind of book, you'd go to Amazon. And what many don't realize now that Amazon has sort of become the everything retailer for all things you can imagine, including medication and groceries and everything, still 49% of all books sold in the United States go through Amazon. 67% of ebooks are Kindle versions sold on Amazon. That number actually used to be about 90%. And of course, a lot of book lovers, and I totally get this, Amazon, point to Amazon and say that it has killed independent bookstores. And independent bookstores are great. I love a good independent bookstore, a good used bookstore. There's other factors involved, but Amazon is probably the biggest involved. We're moving toward a world where one company dominates the distribution and format of publishing. Not to mention dominating retail, right? And that domination should concern you. Concentrated power, right? It is not democratic and typically is not good for the people. Something in books that is good for people and I think cool, and of course Amazon has to have their hand in it, self-publishing. One advancement in technology and distribution that has been actually pretty cool and quite democratic has been self-publishing. Amazon does this. Lulu, those are some of the more popular names out there that allow creators, writers, authors to bypass the traditional system. It's a growing way for people to discover new writers. Now, the goal for most authors is still to get that book deal. It's more lucrative. You have more people working on your side to promote your book. But self-publishing does do a cool thing in that it removes the gatekeeper. It removes the gatekeeper and allows you to push your book out. We can't really talk about the book industry without talking about artificial intelligence, AI. All right, AI. AI is involved in every aspect of media these days, and it certainly has been a disruption in the book industry. A 2025 survey by the Book Industry Study Group found that 46% of book industry professionals are using AI tools. Now, what they're using them for, a whole host of different reasons. And I'm not saying they're writing books with this. They're book industry professionals. So they're, promoting books, signing authors, all these sorts of things. But 98% of those book industry professionals said they had significant concerns about AI. In fact, only 2% said they had no worries at all. Their number one concern, copyright. Copyright. 86% believe that AI has inadequate controls around copyrighted materials. This is a big deal because where is AI training itself, or where are people training AI? Where are they getting the information they're using? All that information is copyrighted. They're taking it from somewhere. And people in the book industry are saying, hey, this is the Wild West. What do we do? How do we regulate this? So AI is creating issues about, efficiency, right? And in many ways, AI can be more efficiency, but working against that is protecting authors and creators' work in this world. Another thing I found interesting out of that same study group, less than 30% of publishing organizations even have formal AI policies. Building the ship as it sails, right? We're still not quite sure how to operate in this AI world, and we can apply that to any media outlet, any media form, so on and so forth. In this digital AI world where we're doing a lot of scrolling, who is actually reading? Who's actually reading? And if you believe that reading builds the brain, I truly think it does. If you believe reading deepens critical thinking, as I do, these numbers are not super hot. One of the things that's happening is that people are not reading for pleasure all that often. Now, I hope when I assign you a chapter out of media and culture, you sit back and think, this is an enjoyable chapter. But I also live on Earth, and I know that that may not be true. But hopefully it is. There was a study published in 2025. This is really interesting. The journal iScience. They looked at 20 years of data from something known as the American Time Use Survey. 236,000 people involved in this. The proportion of Americans who read for pleasure on an average day dropped from 28% in 2004 to just 16% in 2023. 28% to 16%. 3% decline per year every year for 2 decades. That's significant. 3% might not sound like a lot. 12% might not sound like a lot. The issue is that this isn't just about books. This goes beyond books. The definition of pleasure reading also included magazines, newspapers, audiobooks, and e-readers. So what are we doing to replace that? We're scrolling. We're scrolling, right? And we're losing some of the critical skill building and thinking that is generated when we actually read. There's a strange paradox here, though. The paradox is that people who do read, hardcore readers, y'all probably know one or two in your lives, if not more. Maybe you are one. The people who still do read, they're reading even more. Check this out. In 2003, readers averaged about an hour and 23 minutes per day. By 2023, it was an hour and 37 minutes. So what's happening here really is that fewer people are reading, but the ones who are reading are going deeper. They're digging in more. You have this smaller, more dedicated reading population. Let's dig into that a little bit further. Part of this study revealed women read more than men. Older adults read more than younger adults. Those who have a higher education and higher income, that tends to correlate with more reading. Probably not surprising, any of those. I think the most troubling finding here are that the gaps where reading is void are widening. The disparities with race, education, income have gotten worse over the last 20 years, or the 20 years that were examined in this survey, not better. Check this out. People with postgraduate education, okay, so we're talking master's degree and higher, were nearly 3 times more likely to read daily than those with a high school education or less. This goes back to what we were talking about in segment 1. How books and reading lead to a better democracy, a more democratized distribution of knowledge. When you don't have that reading happening equitably for a variety of reasons across many different demographics, knowledge is not spread equally. So why is all this happening? Well, the researchers involved in this study pointed to something called displacement theory. And I studied this a little bit when I was at the University of Texas. Displacement theory is this idea that people only have a finite amount of time that they spend with media, right? And they only have a finite amount of time that they spend in a leisurely way. So with digital media, streaming, social media coming in, knocking at the door, flashy, quick, on these cool devices, it's competing for the same hours as reading once did, and it's taking away with it. It makes sense, right? It's really not that big of a mystery. I was reading a story from Vulture, and they did a survey about reading and people's reading habits, and one book industry insider said it really well, and I made notes of this. He said, people are reading like they're scrolling, looking for dopamine hits. Our minds are so trained now to look for those quick hits, the funny video. Oh, there's a kitty. Oh my gosh, that guy fell off the balcony. But literary novels, nonfiction, they're not designed to work that way. They don't push the button the same way that social media does. It's a dopamine hit. We're looking for that hit. We're fiending for it. And books aren't doing it. Books aren't doing it the way that the scrolling on our phones can do. Another insider in that same article said, as long as food and housing costs are up, book sales are going to go down. People are prioritizing need over want or leisure. COVID was actually good for books. COVID was really good for books. More people were reading, but even with that spike in 2020, 2021, it didn't reverse this long-term decline. So as we wrap up segment 2, where does this leave us? Books remain symbolically and practically vital to our economy and the way that we share ideas. There's growth in areas like ebooks. There's growth in areas like audiobooks. So this format in the industry is evolving. And it's a little hard to keep up with it, but it's important to evolve with it. But our habits that maybe people in the book industry were used to, reading for pleasure, sitting down with a book or a magazine, at the end of the day with maybe a glass of wine or a cup of coffee or whatever, that idea is in trouble because we love to scroll. The mass communication story here is that the people who are most affected by this are those with the least access to education and resources. Again, how do we continue to democratize knowledge? How do we do it? So I don't think the book industry is dying in any way. Please don't take these numbers that way. I think it's transforming. And the people who are participating in this transformation, that's something to keep an eye on. It's really important to keep an eye on that. All right, let's grab another break. And after that, we'll come back and we're going to talk something that I know is very near and dear to the hearts of our college student audience, and that is textbooks. Holy smokes, I still got so many textbooks from my days in school. You can come see them in my office sometime. This is Media Mac. We'll be right back.
Want real journalism experience? Join the Questonian. Build your portfolio, develop professional skills, and tell the stories that matter to our campus. Enroll in JOUR 202 or 203 for 4 credits. Questions? Email thequestonian@questa.edu. The Questonian. Your story starts here.
It is time for segment number 3. You're listening to Media Mac with Dr. Shermak. Welcome back from the break. We are talking books here in week 2, and in our third segment, we're going to get into textbooks. Textbooks for those college students out there. I was a college student for a very long time, and more recently than you might think, so this is very fresh in my mind. Let's talk about this part of the book industry that hits you right where you live, right? These textbooks, and this directly connects, if you're in the Journalism 200 class at Questa, this connects directly to our discussion board for week 2. So pay close attention. It'll give you some background for that. So in the world of textbooks, I was looking at some data from College Board. If you can't tell, I'm kind of a data geek. 24-25. Schools estimate that books and supplies cost full-time undergraduates about $1,300 per year. Interestingly enough, and I don't know if I can explain this, and I'm almost a little ashamed of it, I kind of hope it's wrong, but it was saying at 2-year institutions like Questa, the average price is even higher, $1,500. Between 2020 and 2023, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that textbook prices went up 7%. That's even faster than tuition inflation. Yikes. And tuition inflation is like the gold standard of garbage inflation. Books are exceeding that. So some nuance to that number. I think it's important to point out that 1,370 figure that I first mentioned from the College Board. It also includes technology and other supplies, not just books. Another survey in 2023, National Association of College Stores, found that the average student spent $285 on course materials that year, about $33 per class. Now that number is actually down 16% from the year before. And they say it's been declining for 15 years. So this is one of those cases when I was kind of prepping for the show, you find a lot of different data. And I was trying to welcome in all data without masking any of it from what I'm seeing in reality, because the reality that I'm seeing on the ground for my classes and the classes for my colleagues, my fellow professors, here at Questa and really around the country, working with different associations and whatnot with people all over the place, I think that costs are coming down on textbooks. They're still too damn high, but I think they're coming down. Why is that? Well, a lot of students are renting. Students have more access to used materials because there's more places to find them online. They're finding workarounds, which may or may not be 100%, we'll call it up to snuff, but I'm not saying anything. They're also sharing. And another part of this that I think is the saddest thing I found in my prep, a lot of students are just skipping the textbook entirely, not buying it at all. In fact, Public Interest Research Group, they do good stuff. They found that 63% of students skipped buying a required textbook. 63% didn't buy the textbook at all. I told y'all during the Welcome podcast, and I think I probably mentioned it on week 1, how valuable our textbook is. And I don't get a kickback from the publisher. I know a lot of people think that it's not my own book that I'm trying to sell you to buy. I just think it's important to have a foundational text serving as a support in a class like this, because there's so much information. I'd record a 5-hour podcast if I covered everything that I wanted to. I need the textbook to do some of that lifting, because no one's going to listen to a 5-hour podcast. So it's tough as a professor, because I think a lot about, well, what if I'm making this book required, if I'm making this book a critical part of the class, what am I forcing my students to do in order to afford it? That's tough. That's an ethical question for me. I lose sleep over that. I really do. And these numbers don't help me gain any of that sleep back. 17% skip purchasing access codes when they needed to complete homework. 90% of those students then worried if that would affect their grade. So it's not this carelessness that maybe we sometimes think. People are still concerned. 25% reported working extra hours to afford course materials. 19% chose which classes to take based on textbook costs. And 11% said they skipped meals because of what textbook costs. Skip meals to pay for a textbook. That's tough. That's tough to hear. And we try to find ways to make things more affordable. I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the ways that we were hoping things would get a little bit more affordable is by moving to more digital formats. In fact, 85% of students in this survey said they have used digital course materials like ebooks, PDFs, interactive platforms. Of course, our book in this class is an e-textbook, but if you choose, you can buy the printed version. I have my printed version that I use in my preparation. But the funny thing is, the promises we were made by textbook reps, people in the industry saying, yeah, digital will save your students. It'll save your students money. I don't know if that's necessarily true. You have these access codes that prevent people from sharing or borrowing, renting. You can't buy a used ebook. You're kind of locked into that digital version. So I'm still not 100% sold on how much digital is really saving people. It's a completely different economic model. And I think it really shifts the power towards publishers and platforms and away from students. What are some ways that are real that are actually helping with these costs? Well, one of the big ones is something known as OER, Open Educational Resources, okay? And this is a movement to push out these materials. These are free public domain course materials that anyone can use, all right? So for example, in my Journalism 201 class, that's the news writing class, we are using an OER book written by Erin Hero up at Palomar College. I hope I have the right college there. Her book is called Chocolate and Broccoli. It's a guide to news writing. It's excellent. It's fantastic. And it's available out there for free. And you're like, well, wait a minute, Shermak, why don't you get a free book for us? The challenge with Journalism 200, I'll just be very real with you, is that it's hard to keep up with the industry with textbooks. People create OER material usually for very little to no pay for their work. So if they make one, it's going to get outdated pretty quick because they're not going to update it every year. We need up-to-date books. In fact, we're going to move to a new edition starting next semester because this industry changes so quickly. The good news about OER This is just some data points. 2015-2016 academic year, only 5% of college faculty used it. By 21-22, that was up to 22%. I haven't seen any newer data than that, but I'm assuming it's higher. 2/3 of faculty agree that textbook prices are a serious problem for students. Yes, we do know. But fewer than half are even aware of OER and Creative Commons licensing. I got to call that one out, because if you don't know now about OER and Creative Commons, you aren't paying attention. So I hope that number is a little older, because certainly out here in California and in the California community college systems, they're talking about it non-stop. And if you don't know what OER is, if you're faculty listening to this, shoot me an email. I'll tell you about it. Government starting to support this. Congress committed $11 million to the Open Textbooks Pilot Program. They say that's going to save students $220 million. We will see. Other programs out there are like the ones that we're using in our class, the First Day Access class, what we do here. Your textbook, the Media and Culture book, Campbell, Martin, and Fabos, is already included in your course fees automatically, and then you look at that through Canvas on the Yuzu reader. Sounds way more complicated than it is. It's one click. You don't have to go buy it separately. You don't have to go hunt down a used copy, and you have it day one, because we, as you know, we hit the ground running, right? So this solution, I think, in my mind, why I choose it, it kind of splits the difference between maybe an OER and a full paid book. You're still paying for the textbook, but it's at a very discounted rate, and it's built right into your enrollment. You can opt out, but no one falls behind because they can't afford the book. And that's really important to me. It's not perfect, that is for sure. And, right now I feel like it's the best we can do. Is it a better system than one where 63% of students skip the textbook? I think it absolutely is. So I'll be really curious to hear your thoughts on textbooks in the discussion board this week. You have one. It's called Textbook Racket. You'll see why I named it that when you look at it. Start thinking critically about this. You are probably the most important part of the textbook system, being a student. Is it broken? Who benefits from this system? Who gets hurt? What are the alternatives? Throw some out there. Use what we discussed today here on the podcast, what you read in your chapter. There's articles I've linked in the discussion. Share your own experiences. That might be the most valuable way to participate. Don't forget, as I always say, you can argue any position you want in your class, but just bring receipts. Support it with support it with evidence. Support your ideas with evidence. Cite the data, cite reading. That's how journalism works. That's what we're doing here. Don't forget, your initial post to that discussion board is due by Thursday at 11:59 Pacific. And then make 2 response posts by Sunday, 11:59 Pacific. So I look forward to hearing more about your textbook experiences there. Let's take a look ahead as we start to wrap up our week 2 episode. You have reading for this week in said textbook. Chapter 10, it's called Books and the Power of Print. Take a read at that. A lot of history involved there. I like it. You all know I'm a nerd. I think you'll nerd on it a little bit too. So I mentioned the discussion board to finish that. And then, of course, we have the week 2 quiz. I'm really excited because next week is kind of my wheelhouse. I'm a newspaper guy. All right. And we talk about newspapers and the birth of journalism next week. So if books are the OG of mass communication, I think newspapers are what happens when that sort of OG meets democracy, nation founding, commerce, daily life. It's really, really fun. There's so much there. So I'm really looking forward to that next week, week 3. As always, if you have any questions, go ahead and jump in the Ask Me Anything board and ask those. You can always email me as well. I do thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful week. And thanks again for listening to the week 2 episode of Media Mac. Dr. Shermak signing off. So long, everybody.